Welcome to the NASIG 2020 session, Knowledge Bases, the Heart of Resource Management. Your presenters are Elizabeth Levkoff-Derushi from Samford University Library, Beth Ashmore, the Associate Head of Acquisitions and Discovery at North Carolina State University, and Eric Van Gordon, a Product Manager at EBSCO. Please refer to the schedule for a complete biography of our speakers. Please also participate in our online forum with questions or comments about this session. The links are below this video. NASIG's Code of Conduct applies to all discussion on the forum. We also hope you'll tweet about this session using the hashtag NASIG2020. We would like to thank the NASIG sponsors for helping us make our online conference freely available.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Beth Ashmore, and I'm going to share our slides, and we'll go ahead and get started with Elizabeth.
Hi there. It's really great to get to present to you guys today in this unusual kind of format. I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so basically I want to talk to you about what we're going to be discussing today. So I don't really recall the first time I heard the term knowledge base, but my first real introduction to knowledge bases wasn't, during my first real library job or when I was getting my MLIS. I just don't remember talking about it. We may have, but my first real introduction to knowledge bases was actually when I began working for EBSCO Information Services Global Knowledge Base, or as we call it, kind of a KB, as an e-content analyst several years back. So it was a really interesting experience for me for many reasons. One of the reasons was because my husband was also working there and still is, but really it was interesting because of what I learned about the metadata lifecycle and vendor relations. I realized that I had a lot to learn about these things, and I realized that I hadn't really understood what I really hadn't understood before, which is really how critical communication is between vendors, publishers, and libraries. After I began my new role as the metadata librarian for serials and electronic resources at Samford University, these concerns came up again in conversation with Beth Ashmore, who actually formerly held my position. And then we continued that conversation with Eric Van Gordon from EBSCO. And now we want to continue that conversation with you all today. So today we will be discussing knowledge bases, both from the librarian's perspective, but also through the perspective of a vendor. And we're going to discuss the future of knowledge bases and what we want to accomplish together. Next slide, please. So one of the issues surrounding the mystery of knowledge bases is that most of them are associated with a set of products. The librarian generally is interacting with an end product, but not the raw metadata itself. If you're using a product like a discovery product from EBSCO or ProQuest or WorldShare, you're likely benefiting from a knowledge base. We can define a knowledge base in several different ways, but essentially the purpose of a KB is to bring together a vendor's grouping of title level metadata organized by the collection in which the title can be acquired. It also brings together publisher title lists with the goal of further grouping together identical or related resources to aid in the identification of the appropriate copy. But the main takeaway here is that a knowledge base supports discovery. Next slide.
So I want to talk a little bit about how we benefit from a knowledge base and how it fits into our larger ILS structure. So chances are, as Elizabeth said, you're benefiting from a knowledge base right now, but it may not be as integrated as you would like it to be. Here's a visualization of the traditional ILS from an article on the Duke University Library's Bitstream blog called "The Backbone of the Library Catalog." The traditional ILS uses a bibliographic database and a patron database as the backbone of the system. Knowledge bases aren't even present in this diagram. They tend to be seen as add-on modules, or they're entirely external to the ILS structure, even though they often serve to link up bibliographic holdings and access information in one place. However, when we look at the structure of next-gen ILSs, like Folio or Ex Libris' ALMA or WorldCat's WMS, the knowledge bases are more central to the structure, with bibliographic information being one of many databases that provides additional information about the resources in the knowledge base. With this structure, as well as with further KBART automation, which we're going to talk about today, it isn't too far to think that we will see a world where not only our entitlements will be communicated through KBART data, but also license terms and business terms like perpetual access, subscriptions, pay-per-view, or open access. It isn't too far to think of next generation ILSs being able to support the transfer of EDI and KBART data all at once to populate our orders and our entitlements and all of the associated terms. So let's look at how knowledge bases do what they do and why we're moving to them being a more core part of our ILS systems. And I'm going to pass it back to Elizabeth.
Okay. So for all of this to happen, it's excuse me, important for us to have a firm understanding of how the data is organized. A knowledge base, like I said before, is a vendor's grouping of title level metadata organized by collection. But when you have that metadata combined with metadata from as many vendors as you possibly can, you now have the record of everything out there-ish. And I say ish because it's impossible to have everything, because metadata changes every single day. What's out there changes every day. Things are published all the time. But a real world example of a collection would be like the Gale Literature Dictionary, the Gale Literature Dictionary of Literary Biography. So these collections are made up of many individual titles, and the metadata to make these collections discoverable generally comes in two different formats. So you have MARC records and you have KBART files. Libraries are the ones most often using the MARC records, and knowledge bases are most often using KBART files. So in this example here, you have these two different fake publishers, one who sells one collection, sometimes known as packages, and the other who has this book collection. These collections each have a list of titles, which would be their title list, and these would include identifiers and other important pieces of information. Next slide. So we take that those title lists, and so the information is then transferred into a linear progression of data from the publisher to the KB to the discovery layer, or that product that maybe your library purchased and maintains, and then in turn it goes to the library user. Next slide. But we still need to consider the library's perspective of that data, because the library doesn't have everything out there. So one particular library, they may decide that they only want 2 titles from the hypothetical book collection. Maybe it's because that publisher allows for each title to be sold individually. But maybe the same library has decided to purchase the science collection, regardless of what individual titles it contains. So what we see here in green would be the library's record of everything. And I think it's really fair to say that most libraries are managing this information themselves. Next slide. Okay, so what we just showed you would be an example of a title list. You know, this list of titles associated with the collection. But the preferred format for this metadata to be communicated to the knowledge base is through a KBART file. It's also important for us to consider the concepts such as uniqueness of copy, appropriate copy, and changing access when discussing knowledge bases. Next slide, please. So the purpose of a knowledge base is not to document every point about a title that makes that particular title unique. The point is to document every point about a title that makes it unique to the knowledge base. This becomes more challenging when there are resources with the same title or other identical pieces of metadata, such as the case with an updated version, perhaps a textbook. The more information that a publisher can provide about a title, the better the knowledge base can reconcile that information to help the end user discover the appropriate copy that they actually want. Next slide, please. So KBART files make the metadata standard so that information can be communicated from publisher to vendor much more quickly. This standard began in 2010 with KBART Phase 1, but KBART Phase 1 really didn't take into account what was needed for organizing, and sorry, it says serials, I meant to say books, as well as it could have. So in 2014, we got KBART Phase 2, which was an improvement, but it really didn't address all of the types of formats as well as it could have. So now NISO has initiated Phase 3, and that's being discussed right now. You can absolutely give them your feedback and really impact where they're going with Phase 3 right now. But all through this, last year, what is known as KBART Automation was formally introduced. Next slide. And here's an example of what types of information are contained in a KBART 2 file. They're usually in the form of an Excel file, and you can go to the NISO website. It's below there on the page for more detailed information if you're interested. I know this isn't the most exciting part of this presentation, discussing this information here, but to me, this is really what we do as librarians. We have our ALA Code of Ethics, and I'm paraphrasing here, but what we do is we significantly influence or control the organization of information. We focus on MARC records as librarians, but we should be focusing on this too, because as KBs move into a more central role, we need to make sure our focus is still on the organization of this metadata too. Next slide.
Thanks, Elizabeth, for the review. This is Eric Van Gordon from EBSCO, and I'm just going to do a brief overview from a vendor perspective of sort of how we've traditionally positioned our knowledge base and some of the ways it's changing and just the magnitude of what we're doing, just to try to level set our thinking around the scope and volume that can be contained in a knowledge base. So the slide we're looking at now really contains two main components that make up the KB. One is on the left-hand side here, the global data. This is what people traditionally think about when you think about a knowledge base. It's sort of that mapping of everything that's out there that can be selected. And of course, it includes your title lists and packages and any embargoes on content and coverage statements and all those things that could be part of a particular set of data. But there's really an important aspect to this is, as a vendor offering a knowledge base, you're not just setting that data there, you're also capturing and reflecting every single customer's unique holdings against that data. So there's that whole secondary component of that global data, what is my data as a library? So as a vendor, you're also tasked with supporting that sort of volume of data. And then from a vendor perspective, and because we're EBSCO and we're also a content provider, it's important to remember that, even though we supply a lot of content to the library space, we're only one of 1,900 vendors that are supplying content. And from a package perspective, only 647 packages in our knowledge base are EBSCO packages. There are over 15,000 that are from publishers directly, other vendors, that make up that corpus of data. So it sets a tone that the volume of content we're talking about here is significant. Next slide, please. The other thing that I think you hear us calling our attention to today, and that gets highlighted and will continue to get highlighted across this space, is the changing role of the knowledge base. If we think traditionally about the knowledge base and holdings management as a way of configuring your link resolve or maybe your publication browse, maybe there's some attachments to your discovery layer. And those are still obviously very much in play. But really, you hear today a little bit about how the KB is starting to power more of your e-resource management lifecycle and really become an engine around which you can simplify workflows, de-silo data, all those terms we throw around. So the graphic here is meant to just expand that at the heart of these systems, that KB can help function both your holdings administration, APIs that can integrate to interfaces of choice. Again, still with the link resolver and A to Z browse, but also drawing in usage analysis and aligning usage and cost per use information around your holdings in a more automated way. Again, with the goal of helping you make those informed decisions. And remembering that all of this sits within that e-resource lifecycle, that thing that repeats every year on a regular cadence, right? So it's not like it's set it and forget it. It's set it, review it, modify, ongoing and ongoing. So it's a cyclical process that the KB is really the hub of. And that's putting a little bit different requirements on what we're asking of it and what we will ask of it down the road, I think, as an industry. Next slide, please. So I wanted to put a few numbers around sort of just from an EBSCO perspective, what we typically manage every day. And one of the interesting data points as we were, as a team working on this presentation is, I was able to kind of pull numbers at one point in time and then look again and see that, we had increased, for example, our databases and packages on here is over 18,000. When we started our work on this, it was around 16,000 several months ago. So the growth and the expansion of the content that we manage, it never slows down. And as Elizabeth attest, she once worked on that team of folks that we have who are dedicated to doing that job every day, making sure that the KB is fully updated to support any and all content that you may be managing in your holdings. But there is a volume of data here that goes on from the 6.4 million titles to the 2.8 billion with a B holdings that are managed, the unique institutional inflections of that content. So it's not something you do lightly. And I know when we are managing those systems and processes, just the sheer volume of data that you have to maintain as you're making updates and changes is something that gets factored in. So any vendor you're working with, no doubt, is doing these things at scale as well. And it matters to how they respond to updates and how they respond to changes. And so one of the things that we want to talk about as we move forward into the next phase of this is, of course, any vendor's putting a lot of effort into it, and you can hear the position of the products changing, but that doesn't mean that there aren't specific workflows or issues or items that you face every day, that you take on challenges that you'd like to see a knowledge base help solve. So I think our next slide is going to reflect upon giving you an opportunity as an audience to sort of raise your hand and say, here, here's my current issues, here's things I'd like to see. So next slide.
Yes, that's exactly right. So below this video, there's going to be some links to a NASIG forum where we would love to hear more about what roles your knowledge base plays at your institution, as well as what frustrations you have with knowledge base functionality. We'll be monitoring that forum, so you can feel free to leave questions for us there, but also just tell us about how you're using a knowledge base. So, let's talk a little bit about frustrations or gaps, a nice way of putting it, in knowledge-based performance. Well, knowledge-based data, as Eric and Elizabeth have shown, has three main stakeholders: the publisher, the knowledge-based vendor, and the library. This can create kind of a they said situation when it comes to metadata. The publisher provides metadata to the knowledge-based provider. The library disagrees with the accuracy of said metadata, and the knowledge base provider is kind of stuck in the middle. As someone who has spent most of my career working with serials, I can say from personal experience, title changes alone have caused me no end of trouble when trying to reconcile what titles are available in a package with what titles I believe should be available in a package. And that doesn't even take into account discrepancies that can occur over coverage. The confusion represents a lack of effective and standardized communication between librarians, publishers, and knowledge-based vendors to ensure that we're all on the same page about what our entitlements are. And KBART represents an effort to make that communication clearer. So to talk about a little bit about entitlements, the appropriate copy problem is still an issue, and it promises to remain so when we have a hybrid environment of access that includes aggregated access, subscribed access, pay-per-view access, DDA, EBA, and open access. And it doesn't even take into account that many of our users are doing their research and finding content entirely outside of our platforms and affiliations, which means there's not always a system to play traffic cop and direct the user to the most appropriate copy. Appropriate copy promises to be even more important as we begin to see more and more content published and assigned digital object identifiers, or DOIs, like data sets and manuscripts that previously were considered unpublished or ancillary content. Related to entitlements are the issues associated with rights management and a library's ability to track how a resource was acquired, what kind of perpetual access or subscription is included, or something in between, and what that access looks like not only this year, but in 10 years or 50 years from now. Beyond the right to access this material, we also need to tie in what individual rights, if any, we have to use the content beyond the single user access. Are things like text and data mining or interlibrary loan permissible? Or are there limits to the ways in which we can use a resource? Probably the biggest challenge of knowledge bases is that setup and maintenance that Elizabeth talked about at the beginning. Because a knowledge base comes to us with that world of resources, that global database, libraries must take the time and manpower to customize it and to continue to customize it to their own resources. This can be a formidable task, even when a library purchases mostly aggregated content, because the resources are often not set it and forget it, like Eric said, but instead constantly changing. This doesn't even take into account open access materials and trials or free offers. Something we are all too familiar with after the recent deluge of free content that came out due to COVID-19. We were all excited to have more access to content, but making it available to our users in a timely fashion could have been a real burden. Finally, while the customization of resources is often unique to each library, addressing errors and changes shouldn't have to be, but it often is. And this can represent a lot of duplication of effort on the part of individual libraries to address problems that are systematic rather than unique to the library. So next, I want to talk a little bit about how my library at North Carolina State University handles these problems in KB management. So at the North Carolina State University Libraries, we address these gaps in knowledge base efforts through a process we call package management. This process includes having a package manager who uses a custom database to reconcile our order data against publisher title lists. Any data that doesn't match gets passed to the package owner, who is a staff member who takes responsibility for a particular package. They do the investigation and they make any necessary corrections. Once the entitlements match the order data, it is then reconciled with title lists from our knowledge base to ensure that these access points are properly customized. Any data that doesn't get matched passes to the package owner for that particular package for investigation and correction. This can be a lengthy process when the data doesn't match, but going through a process such as this is necessary to ensure that our entitlements are what they should be to support user access. While this process addresses the access we believe we are entitled to, it doesn't address errors and entitlements that occur on the publisher site. This is where access verification comes in. Package owners will identify packages that they believe to be vulnerable to access issues, like after a big platform migration or a big change in our entitlement structure where we've gone from a big deal to individual subscriptions. For all errors, we take a fix-it failure approach where we address access disruption as they're identified by users as well as our colleagues. While neither of these approaches is foolproof to catch all problems, they serve to create some measure of data quality when it comes to access and the KB. So what can knowledge bases do for us in the future to address some of these problems? What's next? Well, KBART Automation, communicating directly from publisher to users to populate entitlements and access points, represents a big step we could take to improve communication and data integrity. And Elizabeth is going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment. We could see how making automated knowledge-based data loads more central to our overall resource management. We could see better integration with all aspects of our ILS, as well as cost and usage data, license rights and limitations, as well as big picture analytics to allow us to evaluate our collections more holistically. So now I'm going to throw it to Elizabeth to talk more about KBART automation.
Okay. So the concepts behind KBART automation can go a long way in solving problems in the metadata lifecycle. So the idea behind KBART automation is that the data is going directly to the library nearly instantaneously. So libraries could, in theory, have instant access to their holdings, which they paid for without delays. To me, that sounds really great. But the concern is also that, like we established before, knowledge-based data is continuing to be used in a more centralized way. We need to create a way to establish a more meaningful way to sort of reconcile these two ideas, right? Because when you bypass the knowledge base, problems in metadata are less visible. You're less aware of when updates are made. And so that's a problem. And there are fewer opportunities for customization, or even really making sure that if you have two different copies of something from two different vendors, are those really being brought together so you know that they are the same title, but maybe they're just on different platforms. But we have such a big duplication of efforts right now. You saw Eric's screen with how many libraries are just using knowledge bases just from EBSCO. So, you know, when you have a problem and you can fix it in one place and it fixes it for thousands of libraries, that's a really great thing. But, you know, that duplication of efforts, it sort of goes both ways, right? And then so you have that faster delivery of metadata across our systems, like I said before, and you have more accurate holdings information because that information is coming directly from the publisher. Next slide, please. And so, you know, we've solved, KBART automation has solved some of these problems, or could, in theory. But one of the problems that it does not solve is the lack of trust in publisher metadata. Problems that begin in the beginning of the life cycle will not be caught necessarily by the KB or the librarian. And so when this doesn't solve, what this doesn't do is solve the lack of communication between the different interested parties. And until we can really have more discussions with those who are making the products we purchase or the products that are being developed down the lines, and until we can really have meaningful discussions about the actual workflows and the data needs of the libraries, then KBART automation is going to have a real difficult time getting off the ground and becoming implemented in a way where those workflows that Beth discussed are no longer what is really driving holdings accuracy. Next slide. So what does all this mean? So we know that we need to focus on improving communication across our stakeholders, not only externally, but internally as well. If we aren't working with other people in our library or reference librarians to help us report problems that are actively getting in the way of discovery, then we can't actively communicate and report those problems. On a personal note, I found that many vendors are receptive to changing or fixing a problem, but they have to know about it. And I found that to be true in a lot of different instances. It's not always true, but in my experience, it usually is. But the response to the problem, that vendor or the publisher, they have to communicate back to you what they're going to do to fix it. And the goal is here is to work together so that when problems in metadata arise, we aren't recreating the wheel. And many libraries, if they haven't already, are moving towards using KBART data or KB data in their workflows right now, not just with the KB automation, but just that data as it stands now. And we're continuing to find new ways to use that information. So one example I have is, you know, Counter has released information on how to use KBART files with Release 5 reports to better examine, I believe, zero usage. So there are a lot of things coming ahead that don't just have to do with KBART automation, but I'd really like to hear some of your thoughts on this, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So, and you're absolutely right. As the KB's role changes, some of the pressures we place on it are also changing. When you're moving beyond linking management and you're moving into, say, usage management, I know for our own work recently, we've been hyper-focused on both supporting the R5 code of practice, but also bringing our usage product, which we've had in the market for a decade, bringing it closer to where you're managing those holdings. Because again, if you look across the way those workflows are evolving, it's all about making decisions. It's all about presenting data at the point where that decision needs to be made. So for us, it's been about bringing the usage data closer to your holdings data. And then, of course, tying that all to your ILS system of choice. So you're getting the data when you need it at the time of service. So that's been a big one for us is getting that UC data in there. And then with a hyper focus on bringing the right data at the right moment to make those decisions. And I think one of the other things that knowledge bases tend to suffer from is this sort of all the data all the time mentality, and that's great. And there's a moment where that matters, right? Where you want the complete view of the world, but oftentimes what you really need is the right view of that data to make that purchase decision, to ensure that the right copy is turned on, that link is configured in the right order, right? So it's all about that focus. So for us as a vendor, and obviously feedback we want from anyone who's out there listening is, where those needs are evolving, where those conversations need to happen, because we don't have all the answers, and nor should we. You all have those answers. You have those pain points. And those are the problems we want to be solving. But just a few of those, just that context setting for me, and being aware of that knowledge base. The role of it is changing. The stresses we're going to put on it are changing, and its requirements are changing, and we want to change them thoughtfully and the right way.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think one of the things that excites me about hearing Eric talk about that stuff is this idea that when we really partner with our KB vendor, we reduce the amount of time that we spend on these kind of verification reconciliation activities. And we are getting more direct information and we're getting more accurate information, and our KB vendor is helping us to do that. And it creates new space for really focusing on our data feeds and how we're reaching users and how we're pushing this information out to them so they can see everything we have. But what we'd really like to know is what you think. What do you think the future of knowledge bases is? Again, in the links below this video, you'll see a link to the NASIG forum for this presentation. Feel free to pop in there and tell us about what's going on at your library and how you hope to leverage your knowledge base as well as your knowledge base vendor in the future. And that is it for us. Please let us know if you have any questions. Our email addresses are here on this last slide. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. And I will turn it back over to Heidi.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this NASIG 2020 session. And Beth, Elizabeth, and Eric will all be monitoring the forum through June. So again, get involved in the conversation, and they will be there to be in that conversation with you. And as Beth said, the links to the forum, the schedule, and our code of conduct are below this video. Please also tweet about this session using the hashtag NASIG 2020. Have a great day.